Hello, everyone. In this episode, we are talking to my friend Tricia Nelson. You might have heard of her before. She's been on tons of news networks. She has a best-selling book called Heal Your Hunger, and she also is the founder of the Heal Your Hunger podcast, the host, rather. In addition to that, she lost 50 pounds, not by doing some crazy fad diet or anything like that. She lost it, rather, by identifying that the root cause of her weight gain was emotional eating. Now, why do we have this on the Health Detective podcast? Well, in my opinion, it's because we are looking for people who have had to go outside of the normal traditional route to figure out their health issues. And in this case, Tricia had this excess weight gain. Certainly, at least at the time of recording this, most Western medicine doctors aren't necessarily trained in emotional eating or what would be implicated with that. So she had to go away from the norm to figure this out. And I think it's very relevant to our audience because, yes, a lot of us have severe health issues and we've had to do pretty crazy things diet-wise to get to where we're at health-wise, but we need to keep that in check, and this is a perfect person to help us do so. We hope you enjoy the episode. Let's get to it. All right, Tricia, welcome to the Health Detective podcast. How are you?
Thanks
this is an interesting topic for me, and I was talking a little bit about this off air, but I never said specifically what it was. And I hate that there's a stereotype with the topic of emotional eating because there's a stereotype that it's something that mostly like women deal with. And that's a male-induced stereotype because we're the ones that don't want to talk about this, right? I think that's silly. And then you add the additional stereotype is it's something that most people would deal with if they were emotionally eating, such as yourself. You know, you get that weight gain for a time. Well, then there's people like me, younger male. I could eat whatever I want and I don't gain weight, but I do get sick. And so there's still consequences to be paid. But emotional eating is something I never really would have looked at until the last year. So I'm super excited to talk to you about this. And of course, with the Health Detective podcast, one of the whole points is just discovering the ways that people kind of became their own detectives and maybe had to go away from the mainstream narrative to figure out their own stuff. So my favorite question is always our first one. And that's just, when did these health symptoms start? I don't know if there was anything more than the emotional eating, but even if that's it, that's fine. Like, when did this begin for you?
Yeah, well, in hindsight, I think from way back when, and I mean way back when, because I'm not a spring chicken. So really, I think as far back as I can remember, like age 3 or 4. But I started to really be concerned. And I mean, honestly, throughout my whole childhood, I had issues with my weight. But when I look back at photos, I'm like, yeah, but I wasn't fat. But as a kid, even, I had what I call fat head, which is that you think you're fat. You know, you think you're fat and you're tortured by your weight, even if you're not overweight at all. So that was the truth for me. But in adolescence, I did start to gain weight. And by age 21, I was 50 pounds overweight. So I definitely had a weight problem by then. And I'd already gone through many diets, many exercise programs, pills and potions and lotions. I was really at it, trying to get to the bottom of it. And, you know, I could lose weight for a time, but I always put the weight back on. So like I was a yo-yo dieter. So I'd be up 30, down 20, up 10. And I had like 5 different sizes of pants in my closet because I never knew what size I'd be. So I always, you know, you always hold out hope for the skinny jeans, right? So that was where I was hoping I'd get to, but I could be there like for a hot second and then I'd be back up the scale. And which is, you know, typical for anybody dieting. 98% of all diets fail. So that was my experience. But it was very frustrating and I hated being fat. I had a roll in my tummy that I would scrunch up in my hands and imagine cutting off, like you cut fat off the side of the steak. I imagine getting some disease where I'd automatically lose weight without having a diet. And I even thought about joining the army where I'd be forced to exercise at boot camp because I hated it. I mean, when I was in binge mode, I hated to exercise. You know, I would just exercise to get, you know, try to, you know, sort of offset what I'd just been doing to myself. But you can't, I mean, I was never able to exercise as much as I ate, you know, because when I was eating high calorie foods. So, but that was kind of the roller coaster ride and the torture I was putting myself under. And, you know, at some point, I just was like, man, I can't keep doing this. Like, this is so frustrating. I'm not getting anywhere, and I'm trying really hard. And I'd done like not just diets, but I'd done, read self-help books. I'd been at 12-step programs.
Wow.
Therapy. I went to an eating disorders therapist for a year, literally twice a week. So I was seriously going at it from all angles. But at the end of the day, when I'm sitting there looking at cookies, I couldn't say no. So that's kind of how it went for me. So it does go way back, and the work that I do with Heal Your Hunger comes directly from my intimate knowledge of what it's like to struggle with food and weight and to feel so
this is so
demoralized by that
important
struggle.
because especially with what we're doing at FDNthrive, some people can come in and they have health challenges, right? Like chronic disease, whatever. And so they might be recommended to make certain dietary changes. Some people, no problem. Come in, don't even think twice about it, right? And then others, they can take the supplements. They'll spend thousands on lab tests elsewhere and then come here and be like, all right, cool, I'm going to try this too. And yet that's the one thing that they can't do. It's like we have the path and it's hard. And I get this. And I don't think I realized how much I got it until the last couple of years because, when I was a kid, I would eat excessive amounts of sugar. Those Hershey nuggets with the almonds in them? I used to eat an entire bag of those.
Yep.
It's disgusting. I mean, this is like significant. Yeah.
I get it. I used to eat a bag of Hershey's Kisses. I think okay. I'm a little older than you, so we didn't have the nugget ones
it's just like you can
later.
eat these insane amounts of food. And then I got into FDN. I never really had a problem initially changing my diet around, and it was all good. And then I'm like looking back because I'm working with someone that does neuro-linguistic programming right now. And they're going back and tracing the thing. They're like, well, you did have these good habits, and then the pandemic started, right? And I guess that was kind of this emotional trigger for me where I know already that I think many people relate to this. I greatly underplayed the stress that the state of the world was causing me in the beginning. And I went from this guy who for, a couple of years, perfect. I had severe cystic acne at one point, all cleared up, never even get a breakout. Not like it's a big deal now, but still I'm getting these things again here and there. And I look at it, I'm like, what happened? Because at some point during day 1 of the pandemic and day 45 roughly, I went back to the binge eating of eating an entire bag of granola where it's 2,000 calories because it's this paleo granola, or allowing sugar in occasionally where I was someone, I like your one title that we'll talk about today, the I Quit Sugar thing, because I thought I quit this. I thought I was done with this, and it lasted for years. And so what I'm getting at here with this is you had said that you did this yo-yo dieting thing and you would get 30 pounds down sometimes and then go back up. Why do you think some people have the ability at any time to do that? Because you're not doing that in a day. I'm sure that took weeks, if not months. So something's going right for a relatively fair period of time. Why does that happen? Because that's such a common story, right? Where people can do something in the right direction. They can clear their skin up in my case, or they can get the weight down and then it comes back. So what happens there?
Well, I think that it's really hard for somebody who has disordered eating or binge eating or some kind of, history with chronic dieting. It's hard for these people, in my experience, me being one of them, it's hard to be cured. Okay. And which might be depressing for somebody to hear. I'm not cured. I've been living in a thin body for 30 years. I have freedom around food that's quite frankly, some days I'm in awe of. I'm in awe of how normal I seem, but it's not lost on me that were I to stop doing the things I do, that I teach others to do as part of my step-by-step system to heal, which I've really nailed it. I've nailed this system for how to overcome emotional eating, but I am an emotional eater. And the thing about that is that if somebody's an emotional eater on the higher end of the spectrum, and we can talk about the spectrum in a bit, but if somebody's on the higher end of the spectrum, it doesn't get up and walk away on its own. It does not get up and walk away on its own, which means it can come back, and it can come back with a vengeance. I have lots of people say I was doing great until the pandemic hit, so it's very typical, and the problem with an addictive habit is that, once an addict, always an addict. Now, it doesn't mean you're eating addictively. It just means that it can come back, which means you want to have a healthy respect for it, and you want to keep doing the things that you did to get that health, and the tendency for us is, I'm good now, I'm going to go eat whatever I want. Like, I'm at the weight I want. But of course, then we put the weight back on. As somebody is, you're very blessed to have a speedy metabolism. Right. Most people don't, and so you have to be vigilant. But it's not vigilant around your, like, it's kind of a funky thing. Like, I think so many people, they think that, well, let me put it this way. I mean, it's basically, it can come back, but you can live in freedom. Okay. So it's sort of like somebody who is diabetic. Like, you can change your diet. If you're type 2, you can change your diet and your exercise, and you can stop being type 2. Like, you can get your numbers down and you can be diabetes free, but it can come back. It can't, if you stop doing the healthy things you're doing, if you start going back to the way you were eating before, it'll come back. So it's kind of like that as an emotional eater. So I live in freedom every day, but I'm not like, I know that if I don't do the things I do to stay in freedom, it can come back. And that's true with an alcoholic. That's true with any kind of addict. So if you're, again, on the higher end of the spectrum of emotional eating or food addiction, you have to be forever vigilant. And I can, like, that's what I show people how to do. And it's not hard to do, but you can't act like, oh, I'm good now. You have to always, and it can also transmute itself. So let's say somebody has anorexia. Like, a lot of times people go through this. The journey with food and your relationship with food is a journey. It's a good word for it because it takes many different forms. And so you can, like, be anorexic in your, for instance, somebody's anorexic in their teens because they have a lot of control, a lot of restrictive control. And so they're anorexic, but then they lose that restrictive control. And so then they're overeating. And so then I'm like, okay, I'm going to purge to get rid of this food because I can no longer keep myself from binging. So they're binging, they're purging, so they're now bulimic. And then that takes its toll. They ruin their esophagus. I mean, they ruin their teeth, the enamel on their teeth. Their life is unmanageable. Yeah. And so they're like, okay, stop the purging, but they're still binging. They still have this tortured relationship with food where they have to have it. So now they're just overeaters and they're gaining weight and they can't control it through purging or restricting. But to me, it's all the same. Okay, it's different faces of the same problem. And to me, that's why I love the term emotional eating, because it's a good umbrella term for any kind of disordered eating. We have orthorexia. Orthorexia is when you're super hyper vigilant about what you put in your mouth. Similar to anorexia, it's pseudo, like it's pseudo healthy because you're like super, like how many grams of fat are in something, or about your ketones, and then about, it's like you get really dialed in with health, or you're vegetarian or vegan, or you got all the best recipes, vegan recipes, or sugar-free this or whatever. But at the end of the day, you're still completely obsessed with food and weight. And so that's another face of it. And to me, I want to be in freedom. I don't want to be restricting. Certainly don't want to be overeating, and I don't want to be obsessed, period, because that's not freedom. And so it's just really important to know that emotional eating it is a journey. It takes many different forms, and to heal, you have to go deeper than the symptom, like FDM. So that's really what we're talking about. But it's tricky, it's insidious, and it can come back with a vengeance.
No. That was my point so many great things to touch on. And I like, because I was going to ask you actually, because I didn't know if this was appropriate, but I like that you used the word addicting or addictive, because that is how I look at a lot of this stuff, especially in the binging category, right? And it's so weird. I'm like more of a spiritual guy. People on this podcast know that, and I feel like almost like attracted to this conversation in a sense, because you're helping me already connect dots. Where I'd been thinking lately, like I would have considered myself addicted to sugar like 4 or 5 years ago, but it's almost like you forget. Or worse yet, I think what I've done is come from a place of ignorance of like not considering it a real addiction, where this quite frankly might be of one of the realest addictions I've ever had.
Right.
And I've been someone who's definitely been subject to that stuff. Again, people on this podcast know like history of substance abuse stuff. And here's what I wanted to bring up, because I think this is where it's particularly tough, because you said the person isn't going to be particularly or ever cured. And I do agree with this. If you're an alcoholic, no one in this world that's worth half their salt in like the world of addiction is going to say, well, listen, go have a drink every weekend, but just one, that's fine. No, you would say, right, yeah, moderate. How are we supposed to stop eating food? And so, of course, you could say there's different categories, right? There's like your processed artificial sweeteners and high sugar foods versus other foods. I get that. But like we are still doing the action in every single way of consuming that food. And you can't give that up. You're not just going to live off fresh air and water. That's not going to happen. And so I think that's why maybe even in my own life and obviously the people that you've seen, there is this constant balance because I didn't think that this could ever come back. I didn't even realize how bad this was before. Because, yeah, for me, it's not, I never purge, but there's a binging thing of like, yeah, if I eat calories, I mean, I can down 2,000, 4,000 calories in a meal. Usually not on that higher end, thankfully, but like 2,000 is nothing for me. It's nothing. I'm a 170-pound guy, 6 feet tall, just a joke. I can get that down and continue on with the day. And I know I don't need that much in any given meal, right? So I don't know if you have any comments on that, but regardless, I would love to hear about the spectrum too afterwards because you referenced that.
Totally. Well, here's the thing, it is an addiction, and it's the hardest of all addictions, in my opinion, because you have to eat. You can't just put the plug in the jug like an alcoholic can. You have to eat, which means you have to take the tiger out of the cage 3 times a day, try to pet the nice kitty and get it back inside the cage without getting your ass torn off, and that's hard to do. And all the more reason why you have to get under it. You have to go deeper because just controlling the symptom you'll run out of steam on that. So to answer your question about the spectrum, it really is a spectrum where emotional eating is on the low end. I think we all are hardwired to have an emotional connection with food. So emotional eating is on the low end and food addictions on the high end of the spectrum. And basically, I was totally a food addict, and I do have a quiz on my website, which will tell somebody where they are on the spectrum. Literally, you'll get a personalized score, and it's a free quiz. It takes 2 minutes to take on my website, healyourhunger.com. But the point is that when you're on the higher end of the spectrum, which I think most people, as far as I can tell in my experience, which is decades now, anybody who struggles chronically with food and weight is on the high end of that spectrum. They're likely close to food addiction, if not a food addict. And, people get scared by the term addict. They really shouldn't. It just means that you have some of the classic signs of addiction, which is like you can't stop once you start, And sure, that may not be true for a salad, but it's probably true for chips, and dip and Hershey's Kisses or Hershey's Almond Nuggets. And, it might be true for other things like ice cream. I mean, I could never understand somebody taking a pint of ice cream out of the refrigerator, taking some of it and putting it in a bowl.
Yeah, it's a miracle, right? I'm like, how do you do that?
Is a serving, I know. So I always took the lid off and threw it away. Like that, we weren't going, we're not using that lid again. So that's the thing is that we eat in volume, but not always. We can be very controlled about things. But again, it's not just the eating of the food, it's the obsession. And that's another classic sign of addiction is does it take over your mind? It's not just the allergy of the body, it's the obsession of the mind. And so that's a big thing. I am physically allergic to sugar, and if I eat sugar, sugar's all I want to eat. So I've had to be really careful about that. And it's easier for me to not eat sugar at all than to try to moderate my sugar intake. Because it is, sugar definitely is a physical, reaction. It's a physically addictive substance. And carbs, processed carbs, metabolize as sugar in our bodies, which is why carbs are hard to stop. So there's definitely the physical, but there's the emotional as well. And so the spectrum, basically, if you're on the high end of the spectrum, you have to do some drastic measures to change your eating. And so it's just really important. I think that's a good place to start is with that quiz so people find out where they are. But the good news is that wherever you are, it's all emotional eating. Like food addicts are definitely emotional eaters. Emotional eaters on the low end of the spectrum aren't necessarily food addicts. But I like the term emotional eating in general, wherever you are on the spectrum, because that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with stuffing our emotions with food. Like that's what's going on.
Do you think it's fair to say that
healed.
there's obviously a physical dependency here to some degree? I mean, people get literal sugar withdrawals. I've experienced those myself. And that's what, again, it comes down to this underestimating it thing. So hopefully people give themselves some grace when they're listening to this. Like, there is real withdrawal symptoms. And since we don't think about it like that, most of us at least, we might not even be realizing we're withdrawing right now. You know, if your buddy's withdrawing off a drug, you'd give him a little break, right? You wouldn't expect them to go work 12 hours that day, right? You might show them some grace. So show yourself the same thing with the sugar stuff.
Yeah.
But what I wanted to ask is, since there is this physical and emotional side, do you think for some people the emotional side kind of triggers it, and then eventually you're stuck as like this physical type of addiction, right? Because I feel like that's what happened to me, kind of.
Yeah, well, it's true, because if it were just a physical addiction, you know, do a detox, get sugar out of your system, you know, and in 5 days, you're good to go. Like, you're good to go. But the problem is that we're lured back because of the emotional addiction. Okay, or emotional dependence, whatever you want to call it, you know. And this is, I do do something called the Quit Sugar Challenge, and in my Quit Sugar Challenge, I do mindset calls as well as the mechanics of quitting sugar, getting it out of your cupboards, knowing the 80 different names for sugars, so you can find it, you know, you can sleuth it out. So I cover everything in terms of quitting sugar, but the mindset calls are really what people love the most, because that's what's really getting the best of them. Is like, people say to me, I don't know how to quit sugar. Like, it's my best friend. Like, this is how I get by. This is what makes me happy, you know? And so it's that void that we have, that we're using food to fill, that has to be addressed alongside of getting clean from the physical addiction. Because if just doing that, I'll tell people, you can be with me for 5 days and quit sugar, but you'll be back to it, you know, in 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks. First of all, sugar's everywhere. You know, everybody's pushing it. You know, it comes in really pretty packaging. It's, you know, socially acceptable. Everybody brings it to parties.
All the kids are doing it. All the kids are doing it.
You know, it's not. Right? Everybody's doing it. So exactly. So it's really important that we get support to do this, but we also have to go deeper and deal with the emotional dependence, because without getting tools for dealing with your emotional dependence, you know, just having it out of your system isn't enough, because you will go back to it.
My NLP coaches have been so helpful lately, because, you know, a coach, one of the great things that they do is they make you realize things about yourself that you don't even realize. Like, I know I'm taking a certain action, but they'll be like, well, have you realized that this action connects here and there and whatever? And so one of the things I do outside of this, like FDN stuff, Tricia, is I speak in the mental health space, but not actually about functional medicine per se. I speak in schools to kids, and it's mostly just a motivational mental health story. Now, when you're doing that, I'm sharing some of the hardest moments of my life and not ever really registering that's what I'm doing, right? I'm like, oh, this is my life. It's like, no, this was emotional, and you're getting emotional in the presentation. So my coach, Gabriella, helped me realize, well, you're going to this food after these presentations because you never really learned how to process those things properly, and you're voluntarily going and sharing it. But then when I asked you about like the physical thing, because this is the problem, I'll trigger it with that. Like summer, I'm good. I chill the hell out, right? Because I'm not really speaking in schools. But the school thing starts, and now even when it's not a school day, when I'm not like actually speaking in a school, I still have that obsession where I am making plans to go get like my favorite sugary product, right? It's like, I can't wait to get off this podcast to go get this, or I can't wait to finish up this work so I can go get that. I'll drive 30 minutes out of the way just to get a specific thing that I wanted. I'm like, okay, Ev, this sounds a lot like when you were abusing substances, my friend. You know, it's like, but it's sugar, so you don't think about it the same way. So I think that spectrum thing is super helpful for people. I hope that they take that into consideration and use that quiz. And also what I love about what you're doing here is I love things that happen to be perfectly working in alignment with what we do at FDNthrive. And I think what you're talking about here is either something people should be doing simultaneously or even preceding an FDNthrive type of program, right? Get that food stuff right. Don't let that be the reason that you're dealing with the chronic health issues, right? Because we can help you here, but that stuff has to be managed a little better beforehand. And so I know that you say, you know, you never cured whatever, but you said it's almost been like 30 years now that you've been a relatively normal weight. Was it 30 years ago already that you started really figuring this out and what your triggers were and how to manage it for yourself? Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, I was super blessed in my early 20s to get help and to get help to go deeper and deal with the underlying causes. So I had a mentor that had been obese and was a spiritual mentor and helped me heal. And then we worked together for many years. And then I parted ways and with him. We're still friends, but I business-wise, about 5 years ago, founded Heal Your Hunger. To really help people online. I codified the whole process. I put it in my book, Heal Your Hunger, 7 Simple Steps to End Emotional Eating Now. And it's so nice that it is in a step-by-step process because it's very clear cut. You know, I find that oftentimes when it comes to disordered eating, there's advice out there that's a little nebulous. It's not bad advice. It's just nebulous and hard to really put into practical terms, like moderation. We talked about moderation. Like, how do you do that? Like, I don't moderate when I eat cookies. You know, I want the whole bag. You know, if there's more left, I'm eating them, you know. So moderation and well-meaning people and coaches and doctors and therapists will suggest moderation, but they don't understand what it's like to be me. You know, they don't understand that I don't have the moderation, you know, lever. Like, I can't do that. Once I start, I can't stop. You know, I'm addicted. That's one of the nature of it, you know, the telltale signs of addiction. So moderation, intuitive eating, you know. So again, on paper, that's a nice concept, you know, listen to your body, find out what you really want. But if you're an emotional eater and you've got all these crazy emotions that are driving your eating, you know, you can't intuit properly, you know. So I would intuit that I should eat all the time. So I'm constantly thinking, no, I think this is what my intuition's saying, but I was really just rationalizing because I had a compulsion to eat, you know. And so when you have a compulsion, which is that gripping need and craving to eat, you can't intuit properly, you know. So intuitive eating, again, it's a nice term, but it's not very actionable when you're an emotional eater. Another one is mindful eating. Like, yeah, it's a nice idea to be mindful, be present. But when I'm on a binge, I am not present. I am shoveling in food and I'm thinking about what I'm going to eat next. And if it's about to run out, I'm thinking about where I'm going to go get it. And so it's like I'm not mindful. And so it's just a nice term, but it doesn't hold a lot of weight for me, pardon the pun, you know, because I really need to go deeper and I need to deal with this compulsion. That compulsion to eat cannot be controlled. So we are constantly dogging ourselves as emotional eaters because we don't have more control. We don't have willpower, but we don't. Like, we just don't. And so what we have to do is get underneath that compulsion and deal with it so that compulsion can be lifted. And I'm here to say, you know, I had somebody say the other day, Tricia, is it true that, like, he said, Tricia, at 11 o'clock at night, I'm crawling the walls. I've got to eat. I'm on this super strict plan and I'm doing good all day long. And at night, I just, you know, I'm like this hungry tiger. And so it's just really important to know that that compulsion can be backed down. That compulsion can be healed, but you have to get underneath it. You have to deal with the emotional causes. You have to deal with the stress of the day, you know, things that compulsion is made of. Otherwise, just trying to, you know, it's like trying to stop a wave. You know, go to the ocean, stand there at the edge of the beach and try to stop a wave. It's impossible, you know, and that's how it is when you have that gripping compulsion to eat.
I love that you brought up the intuitive eating thing, because I think that was a very kind but still firm, you know, that's gotten taken too far. And this is coming from someone who's had the privilege of interviewing a young woman named Lily, friend of mine. And you know what, guys, results don't lie. So you can kind of see if it's working for someone. Lily's before and after photos are someone who was clearly starving. She shares all this publicly, lost her period, all this stuff. And her version of intuitive eating now is fit. She looks great. She's glowing. She's healthy. That is what she needed, right, for her specific thing. If intuitive eating is leading to severe skin issues or obesity, I don't know that the body would ever do that intuitively. I'm not an expert, but I would imagine that that's not the case, right? So there needs to be a line drawn about when this can and can't be used for people, because cravings are not intuition. If we were all like Native Americans still and we could easily identify the difference between our intuitions and emotions or whatever, okay, that's fair. But I think the concept, again, it's actually perfect, right? If that really is something that you could tap into, it's beautiful. But intuitions are getting confused with other things, and I think that leads to problems for people. So again, the results don't lie.
Yeah, no, it's true. And the truth is that if you clear out the emotional baggage, and I don't mean you have to go to 20 years of therapy, because you don't, you know what I mean? Like, I make it really clear. Emotional eaters are very, you know, if there was a mold made for emotional eaters, you could put us all in the mold and not a hair would hang out. Okay. So we're very common in the way we react to life. And so, and again, this is where I take the guesswork out of it. I have identified 24 personality traits that make up the emotional eater's personality. And these are the traits that get us into trouble. They have nothing to do with food. You know, I mean, my work really has very little to do with food. People know what they're supposed to eat. Like, they're not stupid. You know, they know salads are better than pizza or hot dogs, you know, but we still want the, you know, the fun foods. And so it's really about dealing with why we can't follow through on the good health advice we know. And this is true for health coaches, especially because, you know, it's the worst position to be in when you're a health coach and you can't do what you suggest people do. You can't walk your talk, you know, and it creates this terrible gap where you're like, oh my God, I feel like a fraud. And that's going to affect your income. You know, that's going to affect how you show up in the world when you're hiding and you've got living this double life. So it's really a big problem when we have all this health knowledge, but knowledge won't fix us. You know, knowing what to eat won't fix us. We have to, you know, be able to follow through on what we know. So when you clear out, you know, when you change the certain things that are trouble spots for us, things like people pleasing, this is the top trait of the anatomy of the emotional eater. I call this the anatomy of the emotional eater. People pleasing is the number one trait that gets us into trouble, because as emotional eaters, we typically want validation from outside ourselves more than your average person. Why? Well, typically we didn't grow up with a strong sense of self-esteem. So we're always looking for the atta-girls or the atta-boys, you know, outside of us. And so we're constantly saying yes, constantly trying to please people with taking on projects, you know, being like super perfect in things that we do. But then that adds all this pressure and stress that we go home and stress eat over. And especially when we're also resentful because nobody's ever as pleased as we plan on them being, right? So we're kind of like, I did all this work and all I got was a thank you. So these are things that are, I often say it's a living problem, not an eating problem. So everyone's trying to fix their food, but they need to fix their life. It's the way we're living that's causing problems. So addressing, you know, these traits is so, so important. And if you do that, then you can hear your intuition. If you have a morning like routine of reducing stress, like meditation or prayer or yoga, things that can help you get connected and centered, then you can tap into your intuition. So they're not mutually exclusive. It's just that intuition in and of itself is, you know, skewed when you have the cravings like you were talking about, you know. So you got to do the deeper work and clear away the problem spots in your life that are causing cravings, so that you can tell the difference between a craving and
going back
intuition.
to what you said before, like, people aren't stupid, right? They know what to eat. And at the very least, and this pisses off so many people, but I feel like we have a very self-aware audience. This is cool. Every single one of us, myself fully included, knows what we can be doing better health-wise right now and finance-wise, right? If I asked you, you could tell me, right? But there's something that's blocking those actions in both those places. And I use finances too, because it's just an essential part of our lives, right? And yet we sit here and not do it. Now, I'm not asking you to give away your secret sauce, nor do we probably have the time, considering how clearly in depth you've studied this, to go through all 24 personality traits. But I know that you mentioned number one is people pleasing. Do you think we could go through like maybe the top like 3 or 4 or something like that?
Yep.
Thanks.
You bet. So people pleasing, no question. Having a racing mind, big problem for emotional eaters. We overthink everything. As overeaters, we overthink. And so it's like, what did she mean by that? Why are they not talking to me? You know, should I call them back? You know, I don't know what to do. Like, if I do this, it's going to piss those people off if I do this. So we're constantly overthinking everything, and that creates all this stress and mind chatter that we want to shut down. And that's why we love carbs, especially because carbs and that serotonin hit that quiets our minds. So our minds are super busy and they drive us nuts. They drive us absolutely nuts. So overthinking is a problem. That's why meditation is so powerful for emotional eaters. And that's also why emotional eaters are like, I can't meditate. My mind's too busy. Well, that's the kind of the point, like that's why we meditate, and I just tell people, stop judging it. Like, sit down, shut up, just light a candle, say a mantra, like whatever can help you slow down. The hardest thing for an emotional eater to do is slow down. We're overdoers. Okay. And we overdo everything, and we not only overthink, but we overdo. So are always, if you want something done, give it to an emotional eater. We are on the go all the time. Why? Because we're running from ourselves. Like, we do not want to catch up to ourselves because we have all kinds of feelings we don't want to feel, but the problem is that's like a hamster wheel that you can't ever stop. And that's why we're exhausted all the time. That's why our adrenals are so often burned out, right? Because we are on the run, and we're running from ourselves because we think we're bad, and we're afraid to catch up to ourselves. So there's a lot going on underneath the surface, and people are like, no, I just like chocolate. I promise you, it's not just that. I like chocolate too, but that is not the crux of the problem, So overthinking, having an erasing mind, overdoing, caretaking. We're big codependents, okay? We love to take on other people's stuff, okay? So if somebody's hurting, we're rescuing them. We're caretaking them. This often comes from a childhood of dysfunction or alcoholism. Oftentimes we've grown up with some kind of trauma, either alcoholic parent, a raging parent, and so we're good at like picking up the slack, good at, just being the responsible kid, which carries, a price tag with it. We don't get to have a childhood, so we're super responsible, but we do caretake, and it's really hard for us to, because we're people pleasers also, it's hard for us to set boundaries on our time. That's how we get into the overdoing cycle, where we're overdoing, and then our adrenals are taxed. So these are things that just come innately to us, but oftentimes they do stem from our childhood, of trauma, for sure. Some other ones, I'm just looking through my book here. There's so many. Fear, I find, as emotional eaters. I was a total scaredy cat, and I didn't look like it. Like I was bold. I did a lot of really courageous things, but underneath, oh my God, I was so afraid of everything. Like, life just scared the bejesus out of me. So I would eat. Like, when I ate, I didn't feel the fear. I didn't feel the fear. And so I could act like I wasn't afraid. But if I wanted to stop overeating, I had to get in touch with that fear and find new ways to bring down that anxiety level. Again, why meditation is so powerful, why community is so powerful, because there's power in numbers. So I do all my programs in community, because when you're with other emotional eaters, it's easier to have a healthy path. It's easier to take the high road, and make a healthy choice. And it also brings down our fear. I do my programs, on Zoom. We do it in groups on Zoom, and the ladies they feel so good every time we have a Zoom meeting, because the fear comes down. And when you see other, people doing healthy habits, you want to do healthy habits. And it just really, it adds to the experience, because that fear is a boogeyman. I mean, it just talks us, that's where all that rationalizing comes from. Like, oh no, I should eat the donut. It comes from the fact that we have this stress, we have this fear, and it transmutes itself in a craving, but it's not really the craving. It's whatever it is that we're trying to avoid in our life, because we have a lot of fear. So those are some of them.
This is amazing. There are like a certain podcasts or certain interviews that I've done throughout time on a variety of topics. I happen to relate to this one. There's some I don't relate to at all, but there's just some people that really, really know their craft, and they're not just out there kind of spitting BS. And I'm not suggesting that anyone on this podcast ever has, but there's a difference between someone who knows their stuff and is like an actual expert. And I feel like when you can just relate so well, it's like very much expert status. It's cool. Because even like those first two things that you said, I mean, it's not like a 50% relation to me. It's like, okay, that's dead on who I am. And you know, most people wouldn't look at me as a people pleaser until you see my cell phone. And it's just interesting for me how all of this is coming up in this coaching. Like you said, because it's not really about the food per se. Maybe you develop some kind of physical thing, sure. But at the end of the day, it's the other stuff that's doing it. And it's like, dude, I'm like, how am I, comparatively speaking, and FDN pays me well, and other things that I do do outside of this pays me well. But I'm like, you are working so much, and there is no way you're making enough compared to these like 14-hour days. Like, you're just adding on stuff for the sake of adding on stuff, right? And of course, yeah, the more stressed out you are, then you're going to want food. Even a normal person would want that, let alone someone that's already prone to this. Yeah, totally relate. I think you're just hitting the nail on the head for many people out there. And so you mentioned like ladies and stuff. And I know that, again, stereotypically, I think women are just more open to the idea of emotional eating. I think it's across the board. But your programs that you offer and the things that you do, do you have men in them? Do you have people that are like me that maybe don't really gain weight particularly easy, but they know they have an emotional eating problem? Like, who do you serve? I
primarily serve women, but in the past year, I've started to take on men, and I do it cool. in a slightly different way with more one-on-one coaching calls. So it's a small number of men. But as I get more interest, I will start the same program I have for women. I'll do with men as well, where they'll have the community with other men. But the nice thing is I have a really clear-cut system that's all it's digitalized in modules, and so people, you know, whether it's men or women, they all relate to the content that I put out for overcoming emotional eating. My step-by-step process works for anyone, no matter who they are.
Yeah, not to jump points here, but you said a lot of great things. And one of the things I wanted to recognize as well is you're brought up like the serotonin type of thing, right? And not that there's not more complexity to this and that you don't need more tools, but I always found it remarkable. I tried it last year when I was experiencing some of this because I didn't recognize, there was no connection for me yet to the food. I thought the feelings were leading to the food, and like to a degree they were. I kind of mean it a little differently than we're talking about today. Like, so I might have said that confusing, but I think you guys know what I mean. The point is, I took 5-HTP thinking that like depression or something was the issue again. And like, I hadn't really dealt with depression in many years. I'm like, this is kind of weird for me. And the 5-HTP, I would notice, would work extraordinarily well. Now, again, there's more to it than that because it didn't work long term, but it was kind of crazy how quickly that would diminish the cravings for me. And guys, don't be stupid, right? Not everyone needs to start taking 5-HTP. For some of you guys, that might be a terrible idea, especially if you're on an SSRI, so it's not medical advice. But for those that don't know, 5-HTP does convert to serotonin and stuff. And so for some people, under certain circumstances, yes, amino acids can be wonderful things. Like I like them in just dealing with mental health clients and stuff like that. So I thought that was interesting that you brought that up as well. We're like just trying to get that the best that we can. And many people don't realize that, yeah, like a high carbohydrate thing, like can actually give us that serotonin that we're looking for, but there's got to be a better way to do it.
Yeah, no.
So cool. I feel like you offer many things, so I want to make sure that we have the appropriate amount of time to talk about all this stuff, because again, I think for what we're doing at FDNthrive, where we're really breaking down the labs and figuring out what's going on with people from a chronic health issue perspective. Guys, I don't care what chronic health issue it is. If you don't get this stuff at least somewhat under control, it's just not going to happen. So whether it's in conjunction with FDNthrive or even preceding it, I think if this relates to you, this is definitely a good person to be talking to and working with. So again, whether it's book, podcast, all this stuff, I'd love for you to honestly just to shout it all out. And of course, we'll put it in the show notes as well.
Great. Yeah, my website is healyourhunger.com. And that's a great way to connect with me. You can actually access the book through. There's a link for the book. There's a link for my podcast. There's the quiz, the free quiz as well. And also a link for my TEDx talk that just came out. That I'm super happy about. And yeah, so, and I'm also on Instagram, Tricia Nelson _ at the end of Nelson. And I do have a Facebook group called The Secret Sauce to End Emotional Eating Now. But all that you can access through healyourhunger.com.
I love, there's been so many times throughout this podcast where, like you're smiling while saying something that to someone could be like, really serious, but I love doing that. I think you can't be too serious about these topics, right? And like, even with the mental health stuff, like I'll laugh like about a panic attack and someone gives me like, oh my God, you can't say that. It's like, dude, like it happened. Let's make the best out of it, right? So I normally have a signature question on this podcast where it's specifically about health in general. But of course, from my understanding, it's not like you were sitting here dealing with a cancer or some specific autoimmune disease. So I think the final question for today could actually be best asked for this specific topic. And so in this case, it would be, if we could give Tricia a magic wand and you could get everyone who is out there emotionally eating to do one thing for their emotional eating or stop doing one thing, what is the one thing that you get them to do?
There's so many, but I would say, there's so many things to do and they're hard to do without support. Most people with emotional eating want to figure it out on their own because they're embarrassed about it. You could save yourself a lot of time by getting support. So, but in terms of a first step, like I will say, if you want to do it on your own, you're like, screw you, I don't want to get support. Basically slow down, like slow the hell down, like stop going at breakneck speed because you're just making your situation worse. And that's whatever health problem you have, because everything's connected. Stress kills, and emotional eaters are really stressed out, and we're in full flight from ourselves. So you got to slow down. But besides slowing down, having a morning routine, really taking some time to be with yourself, to connect with source, your divine spirit. That's going to make a huge difference and give you answers that you need. But again, reach out for help as well, because it's so much easier to do this when you have support. And if you could have figured it out on your own, you probably would have. So there's no shame. We have no issues, getting a health coach if we've got some kind of health problem, or getting a trainer if we want to get fit, and train for triathlon or something. But when it comes to eating, we're like, no, I got it, I'm good. And yet it's the problem we've had the longest. It's the hardest to overcome because it is an addictive habit, and yet you have to eat, and you probably aren't going to figure it out on your own, because you need to take a different tack. Diets will not do it. So my 2 top forms of advice are: don't diet, slow down, and reach out for help. I know that's 3, but anyway, there you go.
It's all good, and I don't normally comment on those afterwards, but I got to add in. Well, no, because it matters a lot, and it's something that I learned in the last year. I generally believe that we all have these subjective, personal, non-negotiables. There's certain things that we will never need coaches for in our life, and then there's other things that we absolutely do. For me, like just a random health habit that I have is like I love catching sunrise, right? I don't need anyone to motivate me for that. I don't need to wake up with someone. In fact, I always do this by myself for the most part, unless I happen to be with my girlfriend that day, then like she'll go out and do it. But no, for the last several years, Ev and Tricia does that on his own. I don't need someone to convince me to do that. I don't need someone to convince me to listen to like the audios and stuff that I listen to, like personal development stuff. Almost everything else I benefit from having support or coaching with, right? So you have to have the self-awareness enough, and this is a general life principle, know what your non-negotiables are, that I could be coaching on that, right? Because I'm doing that so well. And then understand for everything else that people at the top of life, they have support for those types of things. And it's not only okay, to me, life's too short. I don't know why I wouldn't hire people and have them in my circle to help accelerate me so that I can be the best version of me while I'm here. But that's my opinion on that. Cool. Tricia, thanks so much for being here today.